Myst, the Book of Atrus continues, as read by the bathroom reader. I am covering for the Plurality Report, who was last seen swimming off the coast of Midway Island in a dissociative fugue state. Chapter 11. "Where are we?" Atrus asked, looking about him at the cave into which they had linked, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the darkness. Gehn edged past him. Standing on tiptoe, he reached into a narrow recess high up at the back of the cave. "This is one of my more recent worlds," he answered, removing a slender box. Within was the linking book that would get them back to Donnie. Quickly checking that it had not been tampered with, he slid it back into the hole in the rock, then turned, looking to Atrus. "This is my 37th age." "Ah," Atrus said, if only because he could think of nothing else. Personally, he would have spent a little time and effort thinking of a name for the age, something mystical and romantic, perhaps. But Gehn was pragmatic when it came to his creations. For 3 years now he had been accompanying his father to these ages, and never once had Gehn thought to give an age a name. Numbers. It was always numbers with his father. At the front of the cave, a narrow tunnel curved away to the left, sloping steadily upward. Fastening his cloak at the neck, Atrus followed Gehn out, wondering what kind of world this was. Up above it was night. They emerged into a rough circle of open grass surrounded on 3 sides by the bare rock of the hillside. Below them, under a dark blue-black sky in which sat 2 small moons, one white, one red, lay an island. At the center of the island was an oval lake. Atrus stood there, taking in the sight, impressed by the circle of low hills that formed a natural bowl about the lake. The lake itself was dark and still, reflecting the twin moons, the surrounding sea, shimmeringly bright. Looking at it, Atrus began to question it, as he always did, wondering what words, what phrases his father had used to get that soft, sculpted shape to the hills. Or was that a product of the underlying rock? Was it limestone or clay, perhaps? And those trees over to the right, were they a natural variant, or had Gehn written them in specifically? The air was sweet and cool, rich with the varied sense of living things. "It's very beautiful," he said finally, looking to his father, but Gehn merely grunted, surveying his work with what seemed a haughty disregard. "I have done much better work than this," he answered, climbing up onto one of the rocks, then stepping down the other side. "In some ways, this is my least successful experiment. I tried to keep it simple. Too simple, possibly." Atrus climbed up onto the rock, hurrying to catch up. He had seen quite a few of his father's ages these past 3 years. He hasn't begun to try making ages yet, but it had never ceased to astonish him that mere words could create such vivid and tangible realities. There was a path leading down between the scattered rocks. After a dozen paces it opened out onto a bare slope covered in thigh-high grass. Below them, maybe a mile or so distant, huddled around the left-hand side of the lake, was a scatter of low rectangular buildings, oddly shaped as if half made of stone, maybe 40 in all, lit by the lamps which hung over doorways and on poles along the harbor's edge. Suspended walkways linked the huts. Beneath the eaves of the nearest huts, a number of dark, upright figures could be glimpsed. Atrus turned to stare at Gehn, surprised. "It's inhabited?" "Yes, but don't expect too much, Atrus. The people of this age are an immensely simple folk. Crude, one might say. They managed to eke out a meager existence by way of fishing and basic agriculture. But as for the culture, well..." Genn's laugh was dismissive. Even so, Atrus felt a strange excitement as the thought of meeting them. Though Gehn had occasionally brought in working parties from one or other of his ages, he had never taken Atrus to an inhabited age. Not before today. They walked on, descending the thickly grassed slope. At first Atrus thought they would come upon the islanders unobserved, but then, 100 yards or so from the edge of the village, a shout went up. Someone had spotted them. At once there was a buzz of voices down below, and signs of sudden, frantic activity. Gehn touched his arm, motioning that he should stop. Atrus glanced at his father, alarmed. "Are we in danger?" Gehn shook his head. "Be patient, Atrus. You are here to observe, so observe." Atrus fell silent, watching as a dozen or so of the tall, man-like figures came up the slope toward them, carrying flaming torches. 10 paces from them, the party stopped, dropping to their knees and bowing their heads, abasing themselves before Gehn. One of their number, the tallest of them, stood, then, coming forward, his head bowed, held out a garland of yellow flowers, offering at the same time a few words of broken Dani. "You are welcome, great master. Your dwelling is prepared." In the flickering light of the torches, Atrus saw what he was wearing. It was a crude, hand-woven copy of a guild cloak. "Good," Gehn said, lowering his head so that the man could place the garland over it. Then, straightening up, he gestured to the men. "Gather the villagers. I shall speak to them at once." "Master," the acolyte answered, glancing at Atrus, his dark eyes curious. "Now lead on," Gehn said, his voice stern, commanding. They went down through a narrow lane flanked by low but spacious huts with steeply sloping roofs of thatch, their wooden walls rising out of a bed of large-shaped boulders. Suspended, slatted wooden walkways swayed gently overhead as they walked through, and as they came out beside the lake, Atrus saw how the earth there had been covered with boards, how steps had been cut into the face of the rock leading down. Below was a kind of harbor, one wall of which had been created by sinking hundreds of long poles into the bottom of the lake to form a sunken barrier. In the harbor were a dozen or so small but sturdy-looking fishing boats, their masts laid flat, their cloth sails furled. People were gathering from all over now, men, women, and children. They were pale-skinned, stocky, clearly human in their dark brown smocks. Their hair was uniformly light in color and spiky, reminding Atrus of straw. Farther along, a channel had been cut through the rock, linking the lake to the open sea. It was not very broad, barely wide enough for a single boat to navigate, but a strong wooden bridge had been thrown across it. On the other side, the land began to climb again, and on the top of a narrow ridge, behind which was the more massive slope of the hill, was what looked like a meeting hut of some kind, much larger than the huts that faced the harbor. As they crossed the bridge and began to climb the slope, Atrus saw lights being hastily lit up ahead. Garlands hung between the wooden posts at the front of the building. Behind them the people of the village gathered, following silently, their torches burning brightly in the moonlit darkness. Coming to the front of the building, Gehn turned, facing the crowd, whose number had grown to several hundred. "People of the 37th age," he began, speaking loudly, the circle of hills making his words echo back to him across the lake. "This is my son, Atrus. I have decided that we shall stay with you for a time. While he is here, you will treat him with the same respect you accord me." Atrus stared at his father, surprised. This was the first he had heard of any of this. But Gehn spoke on, his voice booming now. "Whatever he wants, you will give him. Whatever he asks, you will do. Is it understood?" "It is understood," 200 voices answered as one. "Good," Gehn said, then raised his left hand imperiously, dismissing them. He returned to Atrus. "Come, Atrus, inside." Atrus hesitated, looking back down the slope at the dispersing villagers, then, pulling his cloak about him, followed his father into the great hut. The interior of the hut was shockingly familiar. It was just like the worship rooms he had seen in several of the great houses back in Dani. Symbolic tapestries hung on 3 of the walls, elaborate and colorful silks, which, Atrus guessed, had been taken from Donny and brought here. There were rugs and screens, and on a low table to the right, a number of golden goblets and bowls, big, jewel-encrusted things that, once again, looked to have been taken from Donny. Dominating the room, however, was a huge wooden desk, like the desk in Ghehn's study. He looked to his father. Gehn was watching him, amused. "You want to know why I brought you here?" Atrus hesitated, then nodded. Gehn walked over to the desk and took his seat, then leaned across, taking a long, thin book from a pile to his side. "The truth is, Atrus, I brought you here for a number of reasons, but mainly so that I might answer a few of those questions you are forever asking me concerning the making of an age. I wanted to flesh out your theoretical knowledge. To that end, you will keep a notebook while you are here. In it you will write down all your observations about this age." He held the book out, letting Atrus take it. "I also want you to experience things for yourself, without preconceptions. I wanted you to see, with your own eyes, the awe in which we are held in the ages." "Awe, father?" "Yes, Atrus, awe. And so they should, for are we not gods? Do they not owe their lives, their very breath to us? Would they be here, had I not written on the whiteness of the page?" Gehn paused, then, "I want you to stay here a while and observe this age, to see just what is possible. It will help you with your own writing. You will stay with one of the locals, an old woman whose husband died some years back. You will be courteous to her, but aloof. You understand?" "I understand." Gehn sat back. "Good. Then go now. My acolyte is just outside. He will take you to where you will be staying." The acolyte walked silently before Atrus, his ceremonial torch, its shaft, carved with tiny Donny symbols, held up before him. Curious villagers knelt and bowed their heads as they passed, a low whisper going from one to another in their wake. When they came to the path through the village, however, the man did not go straight on toward the cave, but turned to the left, climbing a narrow set of steps between 2 huts that climbed up past their steeply sloping roofs. Atrus followed, coming out above the village on a path that seemed to lead nowhere. Ahead of them was only the dark, moonlit slope of the hill. The man led on, walking slowly, solemnly, as if at the head of a great procession. Atrus looked back toward the harbor, his eyes finding the bridge, and, beyond it in the darkness, the meeting hut. Beyond that, visible only now that the lanterns had been lit inside, was a long, low tent. As Atrus watched, he saw his father walk across and duck beneath the canvas flap. He turned back. Ahead of him, to his left, just over the hump of the hill, there was a hint of light. As they climbed, it grew, revealing the outline of a hut just over the brow of the slope. The light was from its open doorway. As they drew nearer, a figure stepped into the light, outlined for one brief moment before it merged with the darkness. The old woman. As the light from the acolyte's torch fell over the front of the hut, she was revealed. Like most of her people, she wore a simple, dark brown smock of coarsely woven cloth. Her hair, likewise, was unsophisticated, its thick gray strands framing her deeply lined face in an unkempt halo. She was the oldest person Atrus had ever seen. She looked away, bowing awkwardly, then stepped back, allowing him to enter the hut. Atrus hesitated, then ducked under the low lintel into a clean, warm space that was filled with the strong, fresh scent of herbs. Looking about him, he saw them at once, all along the right-hand wall, above 2 narrow shelves of pots and pans. Sprig after sprig of herbs hung on tiny wooden hooks. The floor was covered in planed wooden boards, the low roof made of rafter and thatch. Halfway down its length, A plain blue curtain cut off his view of the rest of the hut.
"Do you want to eat?"
the old woman asked, uncomfortable in his presence, her Donnie even more rudimentary than the acolytes. Atrus shook his head. "Thank you. I'm not really hungry."
"Ah."
Her nod seemed more from nervousness than agreement. She looked at him anxiously, her brown eyes never leaving his face.
"You want to sleep?"
The truth was, he wasn't really tired. After all, back in Donnie, it was barely supper time. Yet he could sense how awkward he was making her feel, and felt awkward himself for doing so. "Yes," he said after a moment, "if you would show me my bed." There was a slight movement in her face which he didn't understand. She seemed regretful. Then, with a tiny shrug, she went across and, pulling the curtain aside a little way, looked back at him, pointing to what seemed a kind of stall. He went across and looked, then laughed, a pleasant laugh of surprise, for there, between the thin wooden walls of his sleeping stall, lay a simple, straw-stuffed mattress. "Like home," he said quietly. The old woman was staring at him, curious now.
"Beg pardon, mister?"
He looked to her, realizing his eyes were moist. "When I was a child, with my grandmother, I had a mattress similar to this."
"Is it no good, master?"
she asked, as if he had been speaking a foreign language. No, it's wonderful." He looked to her and smiled, strangely grateful to her. Then, on impulse, remembering the pleasure his grandmother had always got from feeding him, he said, "Can I change my mind? I mean, about the food?"
"Of course, master,"
the old woman said, a smile lighting her face for the first time.
"I bring you soup and bread, yes?"
He grinned. "It sounds marvelous."
"Then you wait, master. I bring you some."
Atrus watched her go, then looked about him, suddenly at ease, breathing in the pleasant scent of the herbs. He knelt, setting his knapsack and the notebook down in a corner of the stall, then removed his cloak and stowed it in the sack. As he straightened up again, the old woman returned, carrying a wooden tray. On it was an earthenware bowl of soup, a wooden spoon, and half a small loaf of brown bread. Atrus accepted it gratefully, then sat, the tray in his lap. Smiling at her, he broke off a hunk of the bread and dipped it into the bowl. For a while he ate in silence, enjoying that simple meal. Finished, he looked up at the old woman.
"Was it okay?"
she asked, a look of deep concern on her heavily lined face. Atrus grinned. "It was wonderful, the best I've ever tasted." The truth was, he had no idea what it had been, but what he'd said wasn't a lie. It had been wonderful, the best soup he had ever tasted, Anna's notwithstanding. His words brought a ray of spring sunlight to the old woman's face.
"You want more, master?"
"Can I?" It was as if, with those two little words, he had offered her all the riches of Donnie. She beamed, then hurried away, returning in a moment with a second bowl and the other half of the loaf.
"There,"
she said, standing over him as he ate, grinning broadly.
"You growing boy, you need food, eh?"
Atrus woke in the darkness before dawn, wondering for an instant where he was, the scent of herbs in that tiny enclosed space oddly disturbing. He sat up, listening to the silence, then stood, making his way quietly outside. Both moons had set, and the land was dark now, intensely dark, the sky almost bright by comparison, like the desert sky at night. Yet looking up, he knew he was not on Earth. Where was the hunter now? Where the dipper? Were they elsewhere in that vast stardust sky? Or was he somewhere else entirely? In another universe, perhaps? The thought was one he had had more and more often these past few months, a dangerous, unspoken thought. And yet the more I discover about writing, the more I challenge my father's view that we are creating the worlds we travel in. What if they weren't so much making those worlds as linking to pre-existing possibilities? At first he had dismissed the notion as a foolish one. Of course they created these worlds. They had to be. How else would they come into being in such precise and predictable forms? Besides, it was simply not possible that an infinite supply of different worlds existed out there, waiting to be tapped. Yet the more he'd thought about it, the more he had come to question his father's simpler explanation. He walked down the slope until he came to a slab of rock overlooking the lake. There he bent down, squatting on his haunches, looking out across the dark bowl of the lake. Now that the moons had almost set, it was close to impossible to distinguish where the lake ended and the land began. It was like peering into the volcano on a moonless night. You could see nothing, but you might imagine everything. That was the thing about darkness, the way it refused to remain a simple absence. Unlike snow, which he had seen on one of Gehn's other ages, the darkness took on forms, thousands of forms, but the dark was both fluid and potent. Behind him, over the crest of the hill, the day was making an appearance. Slowly, very slowly, light bled into the bowl, etching a sharp-edged shadows on the hillside facing him. Atrus watched it, fascinated, then turned, squinting against the bright arc that peeped above the curve of the hill. Turning back, he noticed something just below him on the edge of the lake. At first he thought it was some kind of sea creature, a seal perhaps, but then, as it straightened up, he saw it clearly, silhouetted in the half-light. A girl! It was a girl! As he watched, she bent down again, making a series of little bobbing motions. He frowned, puzzled. What in Kareth's name was she doing? Then, with a little jolt, he understood. Washing! She was washing! That little mound beside her was a basket full of sodden clothes. He laughed, and as he did, he saw her tense and look around like a startled animal. Gathering up her basket, she scurried up the hillside, disappearing over the dark hump of the hill, her tiny figure briefly outlined against the arc of the sun. Atrus watched, astonished by her reaction, then stood. The sun was half risen now. In its light he could see the thatched roof of the hut, its long, dark shape embedded in the deeper darkness of the slope. Atrus turned, making a slow circle, his arms outstretched, as he breathed in the rich, clear air. Then, determined to make an early start, he hurried up the slope, making for the hut.